Good evening and welcome to the first of tonight's events, hosted by tonight's chair, Chalres Anson, with two of the UK's foremost media commentators, Ben Macintyre and James Naughtie. Charles will be familiar to many festival regulars. In a distinguished diplomatic career, he served in the British embassies of Washington and Tehran before and during the Iranian Revolution. Worked in the Downing Street press office for two prime ministers, James Callaghan and Margaret Thatcher, and served for many years as press secretary to the Queen. Ben Macintyre is a columnist and associate editor on The Times. He has worked at the newspapers as the newspaper's correspondent in New York, Paris, and Washington. He is the author of 9 highly acclaimed books, including Agent Zigzag, shortlisted for the Costa Biography Award and the Galaxy British Book Award for Biography of the Year 2008, the #1 bestseller Operation Mincemeat, and Double Cross. His new book, A Spy Amongst Friends, is the definitive biography of Kim Philby and has recently been televised on the BBC, with Ben playing a central role. James, to say the least.
Typical.
James Naughtie is one of the best-known broadcasters in the UK, a presenter of Today on BBC Radio 4 and The Face of the Proms. He has also written about politics in London and Washington for many years. His novel, The Madness of July, is a sophisticated thriller about loyalty, survival, and family rivalry deep in the Cold War, and draws on his decades of experience as a political insider in Washington and Westminster. His book has been described by novelist Kate Moss as a hugely satisfying thriller that grips from the first page to the last. So please do join me in welcoming Charles, Jim, and Ben for what is bound to be an intriguing and utterly fascinating session.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Very nice. That was rather blush-inducing, wasn't it? Can't wait to hear what I've got to say after that.
Yes, that's it, yeah. Good evening, everyone. I can't think of a more agreeable way to spend a Friday evening, sunny Friday evening like this, than to sit down for a good talk about spies and espionage. And I think partly because I think one thing that all of us, everybody in this room, has in common is that we're all snoopers. We all snoop and enjoy it from childhood onwards. And I doubt anybody in this room in the last week has failed to eavesdrop on a conversation on a train, perhaps look at someone's open diary by mistake, and certainly on a winter's evening in London or Brighton, walked slowly through a square on a dark night and spent a lot of time snooping into someone's drawing room. So it's built into us. So I think this is very much at the heart of human nature, spying and secrecy. I'm delighted to have two such acclaimed broadcasters stroke authors and authors stroke broadcasters with us today to talk about it. A little just on the format of this session. Jim is going to speak about his book for 15 minutes. And why he's written it, and followed by Ben talking about his book about Kim Philby. And then after that, we'll have a discussion up here on the nature of espionage, about loyalty and deception, about how espionage has changed, and about their books, of course. And then we'll throw it open to this very esteemed audience, and I'm sure amongst them we must have some spies in a room this big.
You'll never know. Yeah. You never know.
Certainly former ministers, law lords and judges and others who've dealt with some of these famous cases over the years. So we shall throw it open for questions about espionage and indeed, if we have time, something else. So Jim, over to you for the first 15 minutes. Strict Today programme discipline,
absolutely.
Please.
Ben's watch is going to keep me on. Charles, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It's absolutely wonderful to be here in this perfect English setting on a summer's evening. It's a magical place, as we all know. And I think it inspires all kinds of thoughts about creativity. I wouldn't claim to have been particularly creative. I started out trying to write a novel which would make people want to turn the page, which seems to me the basic point. And I found myself writing something which became somewhat different. And I'll just try to sketch that in. On the point that you just made, Charles, I did at one point in my wrestling with a plot meet somebody whom I did know to have been involved in these matters at a very high level. And we were at some table somewhere, and I said, look, you can perhaps help me. I'm thinking of writing a novel about this, and I've got a plot problem. I'd really like to have something that might have happened, etc., etc. And I floated a few thoughts, and he said to me in a sort of owlish kind of way, well, why don't you think of X, Y, Z? Because that's really I think that would be quite interesting. And I said, thank you very much. A couple of years later, I had written the book, finally got round to it. It had gone to the printers, and the publishers had finished it, had gone to the printers. And I ran into this rather distinguished man by chance a few weeks later, before publication. And I said, you know, I've never written to thank you, but I used your information, and I've done it in the plot, and it's coming out. And he said, I know. I mean, but it's what they say. But the point about this, they rather enjoy it, and then they slip off into the night. But, you know, I did start wanting to write a story which was set in Westminster, basically, in the 70s when I started to work there. I had started to construct a plot which was vaguely contemporary, and I made the mistake of showing it to my wife, who's a writer, whom Ben knows, who's got a gimlet intelligence and eye. And she said, well, when exactly is it set? An awkward question. And I said, well, sort of nowish. And she said, that's not good enough. And I said, take it back. Why don't you go back to when, you know, you first encountered Westminster? And I said, well, I can't, because the clues are all about texts on phones and emails and all the rest of it. She said, get rid of it. So I did. And the liberation. Fleming, who is the protagonist in this book and is a Foreign Office minister and a former spy, who was a good man, but in politics now and asked to help to solve a terrible mystery and dangerous set of circumstances that unfold in 6 days in a very hot summer. Fleming spends half his time going around London trying to find a phone box that works. He goes off as a foreign minister to walk in St James's Park, and no one knows where he's gone. And the cabinet cabinet secretary's tearing his hair out, saying, "Where the hell is he? Someday I'll be able to track these people. Can't come soon enough for me." And the revelation and the interest of going back was one great enjoyment about it. The second thing was that, of course, I discovered I was writing a book about something that I hadn't started to write about. And it was exactly the point that, Charles, you've raised in your opening remarks. And it's that desire to know, but also the accompanying desire not to reveal. In other words, when we have conversations, not just in the secret world or in government or in politics more broadly, but in families too, the most interesting thing about conversations is, of course, often not what's said, but what is unsaid. And what I discovered when I started writing dialogue, which I've never done, I mean, I've been telling stories all my life, most of them true, certainly since I joined the BBC, or at least true when I said them, if you see what I mean. I believe them to be true. So telling stories has not been a problem, but I've never told a fictional story before, never written dialogue, which I discovered I enjoyed very much. Much of it's too long, but that's my problem. I'll sort that out in time. I didn't appreciate that laugh. That was rather too quick. But anyway. But the thing is, I discovered I was writing a story about people who can't tell the truth to each other, ever. Not because they're bad, necessarily. Some of them are. Some of them come to a sticky end. And some of them are engaged in manoeuvres which they shouldn't be engaged in. But even if they're good, even if they're being honest, they're concerned about what they can reveal. And they're wondering, why did he say that? Why didn't he do that? What's that all about? And that is the way that people behave. I'll just read you a little bit. Fleming is a Foreign Office minister. He's on the rise. He's a kind of number two, I suppose, sort of Minister of State figure in the Foreign Office. Hopes to get to the cabinet. He's surrounded by rivals. He's a gilded figure. He comes of a well-off family in Scotland, reasonably well-off anyway. They've got a kind of Perthshire estate. He was, apparently, we learn in this, a very good spy when he was in that game. So he's a guy with a lot going for him. But he understands as he gets into politics that the the most difficult thing in politics is not to decide what to do about a budget or a treaty or a piece of legislation. It is how to deal with friends and rivals. And that the more you commit yourself, which people like him do absolutely, because it's the only way to do it, to the political game, the more you learn that it will repay you quite often in painful ways. Because to mix a terrible metaphor, the higher up the greasy pole you get, the narrower the pyramid is at the top. You know what I mean. There's someone on a greasy pole next to you. I remember having a conversation with an American congressman years ago in the fringes of a Republican convention in New York, which he, for reasons I could well understand, was trying to escape from. He was a Republican congressman. And we were sitting in a hotel waiting to do an interview, and we talked about this, and I'd written a book about Blair and Brown, which is a kind of voyage into psychotherapy, basically, 12 years ago, from which I've never recovered. Certainly my relationship with one of them has never recovered, and I leave you to guess which one it is. But anyway, this is off the record, isn't it? But we were talking about rivalry, and he said, you know, what people outside the political game don't realize is the most difficult thing is often not the political decision you make. It's how you deal with friends who are going to be left behind or going to be bypassed on the way. That is the real, the hidden pain of a successful political career. Lloyd George said there were no friendships at the top. And Fleming, I think, begins to realize this. There's a moment when he realizes, he says near the end of the book, I mean, I can't give anything away about the plot. I mean, it would take me too long for a start, but it would be unfair. But he says to his friend, the cabinet secretary, with whom he's been engaged in these 6 torrid days at the end, he said, I love the life, talking of politics. He said, I want the wheel to keep turning. The price is too high, but I know I'll always pay it. I just have to accept that along with the good, there is always a touch of the terrible. Madness, too, and nearer the surface than we think. That's the truth I've learned. And that's near the climax of this. But there's a moment earlier in the book where he recollects, at the height of the crisis, he's about to go back to Scotland, which he loves, and it's a place that sustains him. But he recalls on a Saturday morning, before he's about to go home to Perthshire, that he had a conversation with his friend, the cabinet secretary, on the Wednesday night, on the terrace of the House of Commons, very late night vote going on, balmy evening, everyone out there, you know, midnight. And he was seduced into saying things about his attitude to the trade that he might not otherwise have said. And he wonders whether he said too much. And he looks back on this conversation, and I think it's an insight into his character, and I'll just read it. It's quite a short passage. Paul, he's the cabinet secretary, had let him continue. 2 party boats passed them on the river on the Thames alongside the terrace, weaving their way towards the south bank, their music carried off into the night. The cover of darkness had encouraged Fleming to go on. A point was reached, he said, where you invited destruction, as if it were inevitable. Maybe madness isn't an aberration, but the natural end to our game, he'd said. Everyone aspired to it in politics, even if they didn't recognize it for what it was. Before they parted half an hour later, he'd been drawn into a conversation that courted yet more danger. Quote, I found out something that troubles me, Paul. I don't want to say more now. I'll choose the right time, but I've seen the fragility underneath. I've always known it was there, and I suppose that's my trouble. I want it all. I need the promise. I enjoy the fear. Paul hadn't pressed him. Tell me when you feel it's right or necessary, and that was all. Now, in his garden, this is 3 or 4 days later, at the start of the day, he recalled how he'd been disturbed enough by his own frankness to tell his driver to take the car away, and had walked home along the river in the warm and soft darkness. Near Chelsea Bridge, on a whim, he'd taken the slimy stone steps down to the water's edge for no purpose but solitude, with the tide rising and streaks of light from the street lamps breaking in the water. He spent a few minutes in isolation there, standing on the lowest step, hidden from any passer-by at the railing above, one hand touching the damp weeds clinging to the stone embankment wall. The world retreated and granted him privacy. Above him, the traffic was thinning out. 1 o'clock struck. Then he heard the faint swish of an oar on water and saw out of the blackness a single rower sliding rapidly and almost noiselessly westwards along the surface, alone on the waterway in the dark. His blades left silver traces picked out in the patches of light, but soon he was gone. His wake disappeared, and the river looked as if nothing had broken its surface. a city of the unexpected, always. When Fleming climbed up the steps to the street and began to walk again, it was at a faster pace. And I think when I wrote that, I didn't really think about why I was writing it, it just seemed a natural part of the story. What I discovered I was exploring with this man, really, was the constant feeling he has of the collision or the tension between the obligations of a public life to which he's very committed and the extent to which you want to preserve privacy and your personal way of looking at the world, and how those two things can never entirely be reconciled. And so, without going into the plot in great detail, I think that's what this guy's all about. I think that's what moves him. And it's so interesting, Ben's an old friend, and reading his Philby book and the way that he's used the friendship with Nicholas Elliott, which he'll describe in a minute, as the way into a story about friendship and betrayal, I think is terribly telling. And in some ways, what I've done here is to say that, the kind of problem that Fleming is faced with between reconciling what he thinks of as his private duty to friends, to family, to his colleagues, against his public obligations about keeping the show on the road in government, is never, ever going to be easy. I think he behaves well, but behaving well never spares you the pain. And the interesting thing in the last sentence that I'll do on this is that when I was thinking about the second book, which is underway, the obvious thing to do is a sequel. I didn't want to do a sequel. Apart from anything else, you won't know, by the way, who's in power, what the government is. There's nobody you can recognize, absolutely nobody that you can recognize. Somebody very sharp in the publisher actually said, went in for a meeting and they said, but there are phrases there. I said, what phrase? Give me an example. And Fleming has got a great rival in the Ministry of Defence, his opposite number, and they're both heading up the cabinet. And at one point somebody says of him dismissively, he's known as Jay, he said, well, of course, Jay, his real ambition is to have a missile system named after him. And they said, you didn't make that up, did you? I said, well, no, I'm afraid I didn't. I mean, that was Dennis Healey on David Owen. But neither Dennis Healey nor David Owen appears in this book. But the point, just to finish on this, the point is that I discovered, really, that I didn't know this man. And so when it came to, I think, of a sequel, I didn't want to go forward. I wanted to go back. So what I've started doing, and you'll like this, what I've started doing is to write a story of him before he went into politics, when he'd had rather a successful career on the kind of front line of the Cold War. And he was in the Paris embassy as an MI6 man in the spring of 1968. Mm-hmm. I mean, bliss.
Oh, perfect.
So that is now underway. And that's because, and this sounds terribly twee when a fiction writer says it, but it's true, I still don't know enough about him. He hasn't told me. Somebody said, where did he go to school? I said, I don't know. And this sounds, he hasn't told me. It's true. They knock on your head and they ask to be let in, some of these characters. But I'm going to find out more about him in writing the second book. So in order to discover who he really is, you'll have to buy the second book as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim, very much. Jim's book, The Madness of July, really focuses very much on the ambiguity between friendship and duty. And this is also very much a central theme of Ben Macintyre's book, A Spy Amongst Friends, which is his 9th book about espionage. So in a sense, he's really snooper writer-in-chief today. And tell us more about him.
I think there's a very good reason why novelists are drawn to this world. And Jim demonstrates this triumphantly in the book. And it's not just that spying and espionage provide this amazing backdrop of loyalty and betrayal and adventure and politics and double-crossing and all that. It's also partly, I think, that spies and novelists really do the same thing, in the sense that spies also create a false world, a kind of an enticing, seductive world. And if they can bring you into that world and make you believe it, then they are in a way doing exactly what a great novelist does. And I think it's absolutely no accident that, in a way, the greatest spy novelists have also often been spies. I mean, David Cornwell, John le Carré is the obvious example, Ian Fleming, Somerset Maugham, Stella Remington even. So I think there is a kind of link between fiction and espionage. But there's an old acronym that is used in intelligence to describe the motivations of the spy, and it's MICE, M-I-C-E, and that stands for money, ideology, coercion, and ego. Those are the 4 elements that are supposed to kind of motivate every spy. Now, in the Philby story, money really doesn't play a part. Coercion doesn't play a part. And you're left, with, in Philby's case, with ideology, which is what he would like us all to believe that he had been motivated by, and ego, which is what I think he was motivated by. But there is another element which makes rather a mess of the acronym, and that is friendship. Because friendship is actually a central element of intelligence work. It is the myth, really, that motivates the relationship between every spy and his handler, is the belief that there is a special kind of relationship going on. And very often, that is not true. Very often it is simply a business relationship under the guise of friendship that is being manipulated for political purposes. And the Philby story has always really been told as a story of ideology and politics. And what I wanted to do was to try and tell it through the prism of friendship. And specifically, and most importantly, through Philby's relationship with his closest and oldest friend, a man called Nicholas Elliot, who very few people have ever heard of. He was a man of the shadows. But he and Philby joined MI6 almost exactly at the same time. They rose through the ranks of the service together. Both were tipped as possible future heads of SIS, MI6. And throughout that time, Elliot was being rigorously and ruthlessly betrayed by Philby at every turn. And the death toll, the butcher's bill, from this one intimate relationship is extraordinary and runs into the hundreds, if not the thousands. So I wanted to look at these 2 men who, in a way, came from identical backgrounds. Eton, in the case of Elliot. Elliot was really created by Eton. I mean, his father was the headmaster of Eton and then later the provost of Eton. Philby went to Westminster. They both went to Trinity College, Cambridge. So they were men who kind of shared everything, really, in terms of their clubs and their backgrounds and apparently their beliefs and their educations, but they went in diametrically opposite directions. And I found that a fascinating place to start. Elliot was one of those Englishmen that John le Carré describes so brilliantly. John le Carré once wrote that the privately educated Englishman is the greatest dissembler on earth. He can have a forced 12 nervous breakdown standing next to you in the bus queue, and you'll never be any the wiser. And that is a almost perfect description of the sort of person Elliot was. He was loyal, he was tough, he was blinkered by his own club ability, I think. He couldn't see beyond the confines of his privileged and elite world. And in that way, he is a very good symbol for really how Philby got away with it. As I say, they joined MI6 together. They rose through the ranks. And I'll just give you one example of the intimacy of the betrayal that went on here. What Elliot didn't know was that by the time he met Kim Philby, Philby was already a Soviet spy of 8 years standing. He'd already established his bona fides. He'd been recruited in 1934, very soon after leaving Cambridge. And he was already, I mean, within a year of knowing Elliot, he was sending back detailed descriptions about Elliot to his NKVD handlers, to his Soviet handlers. So whatever Elliot was telling him was going directly back to the center in Moscow. And the first, and in some ways the most extraordinary of the betrayals, occurred during the war, which was when Elliot was posted to Istanbul. And quite early on in his career, he was currently, at that point, they were both working for Section 5 of MI6, which is the counterintelligence section. And Elliot brilliantly managed to arrange the exfiltration of a defector, a very senior German defector from the Abwehr, from German intelligence, who was called Erich Vermeeren. And it was a very exciting story. They spirited him out of Istanbul, got him through Cairo, back to London. And he was debriefed in Kim Philby's mother's flat. And the two of them spent days going through the Vermeeren testimony, and it contained some amazing material. And its effect on the German Abwehr was catastrophic. Actually, Hitler wound up the Abwehr, German military intelligence, quite soon after Vermeeren's defection. And Elliot was considered to be an absolute hero within MI6 for having pulled off this amazing intelligence coup. But what he didn't know was that Philby was, of course, passing everything back. And one of the things that Vermeeren produced during his debriefing was a long list of anti-Bolshevik Catholic Germans in East Germany who could be used, it was hoped, as the kind of basis for building a sort of anti-red Germany after the war. So these were people who were obviously deeply committed to a fight against communism as well as a fight against Nazism. And the whole list was handed over by Philby to Moscow Center. And when MI6 and MI5 went looking for these characters after the war, they had all been liquidated. Because what Philby had done effectively was to provide a shopping list for the Red Army as it poured into East Germany, and they mopped up every single one. And that was just the first, in a way, of the betrayals that Elliot couldn't see at all. His moment of greatest triumph was actually a moment of sort of brutal tragedy. And that was, in a way, the leitmotif for the rest of their relationship. And I won't give away the whole story. But Philby's rise is an extraordinary phenomenon. I mean, it is an amazing achievement. He ended up in MI6 running the anti-Soviet operations of MI6. So, in fact, his job was hunting people like him. Now, no one's ever done that before. I mean, it's an astonishing achievement. He wasn't just sort of the fox guarding the hen coop. He was actually building the bloody hen coop. And it was an amazing achievement. And I think part of the reason why he couldn't be seen, he was sort of invisible within the service, is because of his club ability. And I think clubs are something that really explain part of this story, and I'll sort of end with this thought. But C.S. Lewis wrote a wonderful essay in 1944 called The Inner Ring, which is about a rather peculiar male English compulsion to believe that whatever the elite club that you belong to, however exclusive it may be, there's another one just over there that is even more exclusive. And once you've got into that one, there's probably another one just beyond there that you're being denied access to. And I think, in a way, that explains Kim Philby, or partly explains Kim Philby. I think to view Kim Philby simply as an ideological creation is to misunderstand the complexity of the man. In fact, he was, although a lifelong communist, a screaming elitist. And to go to Westminster is quite an exclusive club. To go to Trinity Cambridge is an even more exclusive club. To end up in MI6, that's a very exclusive club. But to be the single KGB agent within MI6, that's a club of one. And I think that, in a way, Philby's kind of hunger to be different, to be elite, to be the person who knows more than anyone else in his organisation, that, in a way, is the other side of his extraordinary success in his career. So I'll leave it there for the time being. Lovely.
Good one. I'd like to explore a bit further this question of clubability and the unique factor that the spy will chase. For the intelligence officer who's straight, it's easy to understand their motive. They're working on behalf of their country and doing essential work, as we all know, whether it's to do with counterterrorism or drugs or relations with other states. For the double agent, it's always much more difficult to understand what their motive is. And I must say, I've always felt with Philby, less so after reading your book, is that it's very hard to feel what his sort of core belief is. Obviously, as a double agent operating in MI6, he's not going to show his sympathy for communism. But even after his defection, there's not a great strength of conviction about his own book that he wrote, or anything he says. He talks about his wife Eleanor, second wife, third wife, I can't remember, there were quite a lot, said, if you had to choose between me and communism, which would you choose? And she said, and Philby said, of the party, of course.
Of course, yeah.
So I just wanted to ask whether, and it sort of touches on Jim's book as well, whether Philby, whether you felt from your research that Philby really was a committed communist, or was he in fact committed and addicted to deception? I mean, there are many who
I think he started out at 18 as a committed ideologue. I think we tend to look at historical characters as if they somehow follow a linear course. I don't think he remained that way. There's no evidence that Philby ever read a word of Marx, or was particularly interested in the theory of communism at all. Indeed, I have no record of him ever having met a member of the proletariat. I don't think that was not the kind of communist he was. He was, I think, addicted to the drug of infidelity. And that went for his political life as well as his private life. I think he was kind of motivated by that. But there's no sense that he was a doctrinaire communist, although, as you say, his very misleading memoirs written after he had defected to Moscow try to give the impression that he has been throughout an absolutely
and
committed...
the Patrick Seal book as well.
The Patrick Seal book does the same thing, that he never wavered in his beliefs. Well, the truth is, it is a very... respectable intellectual position in 1934 to be a communist.
Yeah.
To continue to be a communist in 1938 after the purges is less respectable, but to keep going is not consistency, it's bigotry.
The curious thing, just to pick up on what Charles said there, because this is the really interesting thing, you explain how he went and effectively sat on a park bench with a wily old Russian who said, okay then, I want you to work for us. And Philby said, yep, that's it. In 1934.
His words were, nobody turns up their nose at joining an elite force.
Right, exactly. Now, so 1934, and he goes through the addiction of betrayal, clearly enjoys it, does dreadful things, and your story about Elliot and Istanbul is the first of them, there's Volkov and all these things. 63, he flees to Moscow. We all get to know the story in 67, 68. And we're invited to believe, I mean, not by you, but generally just by the story, that from 1963 until his death, he believed that he'd ended up in the right place and that it had all been worth it. I find that extraordinarily hard to credit. Did you ever, or have you ever come across anyone who knew him or who's gone through the story from a more informed position than most of us have, who believes that there were moments when he really doubted it?
I think there's very little doubt that his exile in Moscow was actually miserable.
Yeah.
I mean, he tried to commit suicide.
Yeah.
A fact that is very little known and certainly not publicised by him or others. The truth is...
They didn't trust him.
They didn't trust him. The irony of it all, really, is that Philby arrived there, and because, this is to leap ahead in the story, but because he had found it so easy to escape from Beirut, the Russians thought that he must be a triple agent.
Yeah, wonderful. Serves him right.
Serves him right. No, I mean, his exile was terrible. There he was in the blissful socialist paradise, actually having a terrible time. And there's good evidence to suggest that he actually knew that communism was cracking up. He died in 1988, and there was clear evidence already that the system was coming apart.
Yeah.
He knew it, but he couldn't face it. And so in a way, there is a sort of poetic justice there, which is that this man who had spent so much of his life living a lie spent the last years of his life lying to himself.
See, the interesting thing, the plot of my book, or part of the plot of my book, is about something slightly different, although it touches on the kinds of betrayals that Ben's talking about. And it's the particular difficulty that you have when two allies who are joined at the hip, the United States and this country, on so many matters in the post-war era, find themselves on one piece of territory, in this case Berlin and the Iron Curtain, in advance of its withdrawal, competing with different interests. Now, it's not as if one country wants to work against the other. They don't. We're friends. We share everything. But of course, we have interests that sometimes diverge. And then someone says, well, look, perhaps you could help and do something for us. And you discover that you're betraying your country, but to an ally. And that's a really painful thing. And, you know, I almost drove myself into a clinic when I was writing this, because every time I wrote a chapter, I'd turn on the television and it said, Americans are bugging Merkel's phone. They can't do that, it's in my book. And sadly, it is. I mean, not Merkel, but you know, I mean, this whole world is, I mean, it's terrible when you're writing and then something, no, take that off the news. I don't want to, let's have a news blackout. I don't want to know that. But you see, the whole business of what betrayal is and how people try to balance their excitement, and I agree totally with Charles' description of it, the addiction to a kind of betrayal, with a knowledge which he must have had by the early 80s, that it was a chimera, it was over, it was exploded.
Well, I think he did. I mean, I think that, I mean, you talk of the Anglo-American intelligence relationship, which of course was tremendously bland in a lot of ways, up until the point that Philby's betrayal was exposed. And once it was, it did such damage to that sense that we will always be on the same side, we can trust everybody. But it is, I mean, James Jesus Angleton, who's another character in my book, had a wonderful expression, it's actually not his, it's T.S. Eliot's, but he used it all the time, to describe the strange, refracting world of intelligence, which is the wilderness of mirrors, which is that after a while, once the mirrors have reflected each other enough, you don't know which side you're on. I mean,
and he effectively went mad at the end.
Completely bonkers, because of Philby's betrayal, really. I mean, Angleton ended up as the head CIA mole hunter, and once his great friend Philby had defected and he realised that he himself had been strung along by a double agent, he really went completely mad. And it's, I mean, it is a very mad world, this one. It is where nothing is quite what you think it's going to be.
You see, the thing about Fleming is that he, I think, and I'll discover more about this as I go on, but I think he was quite good at what he did, and he chunted around. He had he's got a scar, rather like Odysseus, some classical scholars may notice. Anyway, he's got a scar that runs from here to here, which happened in a dark street in Vienna, some unknown thing, which I'll describe at some point in the future. And he got out for reasons we don't yet know, but probably very good reasons, into politics. But, you know, I think that he understands exactly the dangers that you're talking about, that you can get into the point where nothing is real, no friendship can be taken on trust. And I think he probably went into politics saying, well, and I don't know which party he's in, I don't really know what he believes, but I think he probably thought there's a kind of public life which is different from the one I've had. Not that I reject the one I had, I revere it, I try to do it in my best possible way, but this is a different way of doing things. And he discovers actually that in political life, in public life, there are many of those same difficulties about how much you reveal, because, well, you do want to be in the cabinet, don't you? And, you know, and there's a point in the first chapter where he meets his friend and rival in the street, and his friend and rival says, what are you doing out here? Oh, going for a walk. What are you doing? Going for lunch, you know me. And he goes up the steps into the Travellers Club, and Fleming walks off to a secret assignation. And he looks over his shoulder, and he sees his friend looking out the door of the club, and the driver of the government car just checking in the mirror what he's doing, and that's life.
It's also a war. I mean, sorry,
Ben,
Charles, yeah.
Perhaps move to the damage that Philby, Burgess and Maclean, the Cambridge Five did. Probably more damage as a group of double agents than anyone else in the 20th century. And some of that's reflected in the edginess between the Americans and the British in your book, Jim.
Yes, were you conscious of that, Jim, when you were... I mean, was that story part of the background?
Well, I think it was. I mean, I think it was... I didn't start out with that idea. I started out trying to write a story about a man who was essentially a good guy, but was navigating, sometimes quite ruthlessly, rivers of rivalry and betrayal. And I think that, you know, this is set vaguely in the mid-1970s. And so it's set against a background where there had been betrayals and everybody knew that there were people worming away. The problem that he discovers in this book is they weren't all worming away on behalf of the Soviets, as they then were. They were worming away on behalf of our allies.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the effect of the Cambridge Five on British intelligence was both practically disastrous and psychologically disastrous. I mean, the practical effects were that every single attempt to send subversives into behind the Iron Curtain was wrapped up before it happened. I mean, and the worst example is the misnamed Operation Valuable, which was the attempt to topple the communist regime in Albania. And Philby, at that point, had ended up in Washington and was sending over not only details of every landing, but he was giving specific parachute drops and names.
Yeah.
Some of the Albanian insurgents that arrived were greeted by the security forces by name. And not only were they captured, tortured and murdered, but their families were wiped out too. So there's a tremendous practical impact. But the psychological impact, you can argue, was even worse, which was absolutely to unleash this mole hunt that has barely finished.
Destructive.
And it still hangs over the intelligence services today because what happened in the 1930s was that the Soviets and the British intelligence services were fishing in the same pond. They were trying to recruit the same sort of people. Young, intelligent, left-leaning, white, upper-middle-class male undergraduates. That's what they were after. But both sides were after them. And that is why Philby was invisible. Now, today, the issue is that we are once again, the intelligence services and our opponents, fishing in the same pond. They're not the same sort of people. They are, on the whole, to characterise and generalise, they are Muslim women, who can infiltrate Al-Qaeda, but who may already be in Al-Qaeda. So you have a similar problem, which is that the security service may already be recruiting people, may already have recruited people who are actually already on the other side.
But the other thing is that I think anybody who reads your book, Ben, and who thinks about this will be reminded of the extraordinarily tight nature of this organization and those circles at the time. And, the Russians' brilliance was in saying, let's get people who are going to get as close as we can imagine to the inner circle. And in those days, if you had the ability to see that that was the point, to get out of your ideology and understand how our system worked, actually we're dealing with rather a small pool of people.
Yeah.
You knew where they would come from.
Yeah.
You knew where they would go. And you knew the clubs to which they would belong, and you knew there would only be so many of them. And if you got the right one, and they were fantastically lucky in getting one who was susceptible to that approach, you were in, because it was tiny.
It was the most successful intelligence operation ever launched. I mean, in the 1930s.
As far as we know.
Well, as far as we know. Well, do you know, there was an Oxford ring as well, but they were just hopeless. That's why we've never heard of them. They were completely useless. But here's the real irony is not only were they brilliant at getting this kind of seed capital of intelligence, just putting it in there and letting them sleep, letting them,
and giving them time.
Giving them time. They were too good, because here's what happened. Because the Cambridge Five produced such a wealth of information, because it all tallied, because it all agreed with itself, back in Moscow, the analyst looked at it and said, well, it's an axiom of intelligence work that if something looks perfect, it must be false.
It's too good.
And so they believed that, I mean, a lot of the stuff that the Cambridge Five were producing was dismissed because it was simply assumed to be false. They must be planting disinformation because it all agreed with itself.
They're far too clever to let these guys do this.
Ben, Jim, one more question, then I want to open it up to this eager audience. I think it's puzzling to me and to a lot of people how it was that Philby was able to go on operating. He was resigned from MI6 after Burgess and Maclean fled in 1951, and he remained on the loose and re-employed by MI6 until 1963. And even at the time when his good friend Elliot was sent to interrogate him in Beirut, a long process that took dinners and lunches and enormous amounts of alcohol. They could have arrested him or bundled him back to Britain and put him on trial. Now, was he allowed to defect simply because it was less embarrassing in this clubby little world to let him go to Moscow than to put him on trial and have all this dirty linen washed in public.
Well, that is certainly my belief. I mean, the critical moment in the Philby-Elliot relationship occurs in Beirut in January 1963, when Elliot finally has evidence against him. He goes to confront him. They have these 3 days of intense kind of dueling going on. It was recorded by MI5 very badly because they left the window open. So all you can really hear are the sort of people, car horns. And people
Should have got the
shouting.
BBC to do it. It would have been much better.
That's why they weren't releasing it,
Yes,
actually,
yes.
because it's a brilliant evidence
Yes.
of total incompetence on the part of people who did it. But there are two ways of interpreting what happened then. Philby liked to make it look as if he had somehow escaped from MI6's clutches. The truth is that Elliot left Beirut and left the door open to Moscow. Now, it's my firm belief, the one thing everyone agrees on is that what they did not want was a public trial of Philby back in London. That would have been crippling. I think they were agnostic, as it were, between whether he remained in Beirut under MI6 control and drank himself to death or fled to Moscow.
Was there a feeling that there might have been people clever enough, stroke stupid enough in Moscow to believe that the ease with which he got out of Beirut was evidence that...
That's exactly right.
Etc.
That's exactly right. That he might therefore be a triple agent.
And from MI6's point of view, look, the damage is done.
Yeah.
There's not much more that he can tell them that he hasn't told
Yeah.
them already.
Yeah.
And by that stage, they knew how much he'd told
told
them. Therefore, you know, why
mess
not
with
just
them.
try to muddy the waters as best we can?
Yeah. That is
I
exactly...
mean, you could see.
Well, they did, and not only they... Yes, let's try and mess with them by implying that Philby is actually our man still. And wonderfully, when Philby died, Elliot drew up an obituary to run in the Times, which was going to read roughly as follows. I can now, my lips have been sealed, but I can now reveal that Philby has been one of our greatest agents.
Yes, yeah.
He is going to be awarded the, the
And why
CMG.
wasn't it
He's a
published?
well, many things have not been published by the Times that are marvellous. I can
yeah.
guarantee that.
Okay.
Well, I can
That's
join
just
that.
thought to be too close to the
That's a
bone.
great point, I think, to open this up to questions. I see a lot of hands going up. If you can wait until the microphones, which are coming round now, come forward.
Microphones and dry martinis, by the way.
Lord, there's a marvellous.
It's really marvellous.
What a very good touch.
Gosh, it's marvellous.
Shaken, not stirred. How marvellous.
And
Look
it's
at
not,
that.
it's not even lunchtime.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Well, here's to you. Thank
Well,
you very
cheers.
much.
Thank
to
you very
our
much.
audience. And I can assure you that it is shaken and not stirred.
Absolutely
By Jove,
delicious.
that's marvellous. Thank you.
We'll take
Must
two or
come
three
here,
questions across the room, and then if you bring a microphone to this lady here, please, and to Lord Hutchinson there, and then you're next.
Thank you. That's fascinating. And I'd like to unpick a bit more your M for motivation. And I'm thinking one of the things that fascinates me about the Cambridge spies is that amazing sort of nexus of masculinity, class, sexuality, and sexual behaviour, which we haven't talked much about, but has been very much, I think, underpinning it. The notion of friendship you raise, and it leads me to reflect on, it seems a very particular and rather weird kind of male friendship, the upper class male friendship that where you never really talk about what you really feel and what's really going on. And that leads me to think about them and their early years at public school, and I don't know all their biographies intimately, but one assumes if they were at public school, they were sent to public school very young, and there was a kind of betrayal, a sense of betrayal in that, because you are kicked out of the family and you go to live with strangers and you have very traumatic experiences. Often you may be abused, you may be lonely, and how that then plays into all these complex things. And I think the class thing, which haven't read your book, but you, Ben, talked about very interestingly in the TV version. And I just wondered if you could unpick that a bit more.
Well, I think you've identified many of the central elements, of motivating elements. I mean, I think the class thing is absolutely critical. I think the public school sense of bonhomie, you describe it as a sort of weird male friendship. I think at the time it was to understand the real strength of the bond between people like Philby and Eliot, you had to have gone through the war together. And I think that produced a particular kind of male belief in each other that could never really be unpicked. And I'm sure that is absolutely part of it. The sexuality thing is fascinating, I think. All 5 of the Cambridge Five were, to greater or lesser degrees, sexual transgressives for the time. They were not following the normal rules. 2 were homosexual, 2 were prodigiously unfaithful to their wives and so on. So, I mean, they had already, in a way, crossed a boundary. They were already part of a secret, illegal group while they were still at Cambridge.
Illegal is important.
Illegal is absolutely vital. They'd already been breaking the law with their normal human behaviour, as we would call it now. But before we over-psychoanalyse them, and I don't know if you'd agree with this, Jim, in terms of your characters, they were also doing it, to be honest, because it was incredibly good fun.
Yeah.
And the romance of it, Philby writes about this rather inadvertently, giving himself away. He says, I was destined for a romantic life. They all 5 of them, and again, I think this is partly a wartime thing, were able to look outside at themselves and think, gosh, I am really quite a romantic figure here.
Yeah, well, I think Fleming, my sort of main character, it certainly has that sense of romance. And I remember talking some years ago to somebody in this game who was serving our country abroad, and I won't make it clear where. And anyway, I met him. It became clear that I sort of knew who he was. Anyway, we had this conversation. And I said, well, I assume you're interested in X, Y, and Z, you know, the terrorist things that are going on in this part of the world, and that's the main part of your job. And he leaned back and took a sip of a drink, not unlike this one, actually, and said, well, I said, yes. Still keep a weather eye open for a passing Russian who might look hungry. And I thought, I said, but you're talking like John Buchan. And he said, well, you know, he said, if you don't think like that, you know, what's the point?
But your use of the word game is exactly right, Jim.
Exactly.
I mean, it still is regarded by some people in this deadly business as a sort of
Kim's game.
Yeah.
The great game.
There's just 2 paragraphs. Fleming, this guy.
2 sentences.
Two sentences. Well, he's in Edinburgh Airport and he rings his wife. He's in the middle of this crisis. She's going nuts. She doesn't know what's going on and she thinks he's concealing everything. And he's been at home for 2 days. And he dialed. Francesca, his wife, was in the garden, and Schubert was coming through the French windows from the radio. She's in Putney. Despite the sun, she wanted to go on a melancholy journey. She was listening to Winterreise, which spoke of a lover's pain. She looked at her watch when she heard the phone ring over the singing. She went quickly inside. It's me. I've made a decision. Will, it's his first name. Darling, I'm going to tell you the whole story. Her voice was cool. Thank you. As far as I can, he said. And that's life.
Yeah.
Jeremy Hutchinson.
I've got 2 questions, Ben, for your brilliant book. And I asked them from the point of view of being a lawyer who represented both Blake and Vassal and Martelli and various other people.
It's a devastating observation.
We must get together afterwards.
First of all, why did Philby, why was he so certain he was nailed at the end? Because he'd survived an endless interrogation earlier from MI5 and so on, so on, so on. And when he was nailed, apart from your book, as far as I could see, there was this woman, Vera Solomon,
Flora Solomon, yeah.
who remembered 25 years ago some very doubtful remark which he made to her when he was a young man in the 20s, that he was working for the Russian intelligence. But when MI5 questioned her, they reported that she was unreliable and had a huge feeling of resentment against him because of his dispatches from Israel supporting the Arabs.
That's right.
And I couldn't understand why he could have easily dealt with her. The other person was the Russian defector, who never actually put his finger on
Philby. But Philby didn't know that. That's the key, is that Philby didn't know that, and Eliot didn't know that. So Eliot went to Beirut believing, because he had been told as much by Dick White, the head of MI6, that they had chapter and verse from a Russian defector. Now, Philby knew that there had been a Russian defector and was already very alarmed that that Russian defector might have fingered him. So, in fact, Philby, you're right, Philby could have bluffed it out. Flora Solomon's testimony was never going to stand up in court anyway, and they knew there was another reason why they didn't want to have a trial. But Elliot didn't know that. Sorry, Philby didn't know that Elliot didn't know that he actually didn't have as much evidence as he thought he had. I'm not explaining that very clearly, but
Just work that out.
but Elliot went to Beirut believing, because he had been told as much, that they really did have proper KGB evidence against Philby. They actually didn't. So in fact, Dick White misled Elliot. I mean, he gave him a false brief when he went out. That's a very simple explanation. Well, it's not actually, but...
What on earth was Philby doing all those years at the top of our intelligence? What was he doing all the time? Because if I could put it in cricket terms, if the captain of the English cricket team was giving the Australians all the information, the weaknesses of his batsmen, he'd only be useful to them so long as he remained captain of England. Then he's got to go on scoring centuries.
But Philby himself put his finger on this problem.
Centuries did Philby...
No, he was very good. You put your finger on it, and Philby did as well. His problem was that he had to be good enough at his ostensible job to retain it and continue to be promoted through it, but not so good that he began to undermine his real loyalty, which was to the KGB. So he had to play a very careful game, which was that he was good enough to be loved and admired. But don't forget, all institutions, are brilliant at overlooking what to us, with hindsight, look like glaring cock-ups.
And remind us, one of the things I think people have to remember about this is not only how small the organisation was and how tightly entwined they all were, but how young he was.
Yes.
I mean, when he went to Beirut, and after there had been the public thing of, are you the third man, Marcus Lipton, the MP for Brixton, and so on, the famous picture at the press conference with Alan Wicker sitting there.
Extraordinary, yeah.
Anyway, and whenever it was, he went to Beirut in 56 to work for The Economist. Now, how old was he in 56?
He was still in his early 40s then.
Exactly. So he was a man, 41, 42?
Yeah.
His entire career in the superstructure, where he did all this damage, was over effectively by the time he was 40.
Yes, and he traded brilliantly on his wartime achievements, which were very considerable. I mean, he had proved to be an extremely effective wartime intelligence officer. And of course, at that point, since Britain and the Soviet Union were on the same side, there was no problem for him in doing it. It's only afterwards, when the Cold War begins, that he has a problem.
Over that side, please.
Thank you very much indeed. The early remarks about what spies were sort of made me smile, because I used to be a very lowly British council wife living overseas, and it was always a great game at dinner parties to spot the British spy. And we were pretty successful, except I have to say in Tehran, where I've lived for 3 years. So congratulations to you.
I was never outed.
But I have two questions. Some time ago, a book came out called Secret Agenda, which was the account of the deception by Edward VIII and his role with Hitler, and about the probably compromising papers that were captured after the war by the Americans. And the only person that they trusted to go in and get these papers, according to this book, was Anthony Blunt, because, of course, he was a cousin of the Queen Mother. And it always struck me that when we look at the protection that the Cambridge Group had, was because I think it came from a very much, higher strata of our society. But there are the two questions I'd like to ask you. The one is a banal one. When I was in Tehran, there was always stories going around that on Philby's, I think it was his Beirut office, but it may well have been his London office, that he had a picture of Mount Ararat taken from the Turkish-Soviet border,
the wrong
and
side
not
of the border.
from the wrong side. So anyone who knew the area would know that it was a signal where he was. But the second one was that looking back at Blunt and going in dangerous to get information which had been very damaging to Britain, great sort of moral force, How do we now view against that moral force and deception Snowden and the fact that our government won't publicise anything on the Chilcot inquiry? Thank you.
Over to you, dear fellow.
Well, I mean, there's stuff for 2 hours there. I'll leave Mount Ararat to you, although I always thought that was a kind of legend that Philby, that was perpetrated afterwards. Snowden, I mean, let's not get into it. I mean, Snowden and Chilcot are two different things. I mean, the Chilcot problem is an American problem. They don't want presidential conversations to be revealed in a way which would set a precedent for other presidential conversations of a different kind to be revealed. And there has been a huge fandango about that. But I think it's pretty regrettable and ridiculous. And I think that if the committee believe that they can get some conversations which will make their point into their report, they should be trying to get it out as quickly as they can. But I think it's a pretty unedifying episode. My understanding is, although the Blair people probably feel there is stuff there that would be embarrassing, I think Blair's beyond embarrassment now on that question. I mean, just, it's just a sort of observation, really. I mean, it's a long time. I think from the American kind of institutional point of view, there's another problem. Snowden is an interesting case, and we could go on about it all night. I think there's a real difficulty, I'd put it no higher than this, that if you're arguing that you're taking a principled action to reveal to people that there are things going on which you believe to be wrong and which they should know about, and I dare say most of us think that some of the things that came out in the Snowden revelations are things that we would rather didn't happen and we should have been aware of. It's pretty tough if you're arguing it on the basis of personal liberty that you hand the whole lot over lock, stock and barrel to Mr. Vladimir Putin. Now, Prince of Wales has got in enough trouble, so I will say nothing more. But I mean, that's quite a difficult argument to make on the grounds of personal liberty, it seems to me. And I think the Snowden thing is not nearly as simple as it appears. And I'll let you get back to Mount Ararat.
Myths and legends cluster around Philby. They cluster still. I mean, people still come up to me and say, well, you do know that he was really working for MI6 the whole time that he was in the Soviet Union. I really don't...
Try proving that he wasn't.
Well, absolutely. You can't prove a negative. So I don't quite believe that. And also, he was so canny. His spycraft was so good. I don't think he would have left such an obvious clue. Yeah.
Have you ever tried... There's a wonderful thing which is in your book, and it's in other books about Philby, where... the game is up in Washington. Burgess, the horror when he realised that not only had McLean gone, but Burgess had gone with him. And he drove out of Washington with the cameras and things, and he went up, some road in Maryland, and he went into a wood and buried them. Now, I mean,
it's still
can you imagine
I've been
the
looking
person who found the cash that Philby buried in 1952 in a suburban, well, not a suburban, a rural road in Pennsylvania? Yes. That would be
wonderful. In fact, I suggested to the BBC when I was making that documentary that we should just employ 100 people with metal detectors.
That doesn't...
I think...
Can I say that doesn't happen anymore at the BBC?
No.
It certainly doesn't.
I think of interest here is that the period after 1951 when... Philby left MI6. He lived in Crowborough for a number of years. So maybe somewhere buried around that exciting.
Marvellous idea.
I just wanted to say that I felt that the MI6 was not very sophisticated in the 70s. When I was a careers advisor at a university, every year someone would come and say, have you got anybody suitable this year?
Did they? They would just straightforwardly come and say...
And what did they describe them as coming? Where did they say they came from?
They needed to be from a public school and have slightly leftish tendencies. The following year, I had a friend who was being positively vetted, and I was asked, does he consort with people with snow on their boots? I had no idea what he meant.
I'm not sure I do either.
But it's maybe not as appalling as you think. We've got a son who's now in his mid-20s, and he told me a story of a friend who was at university who was recruited by one of the agencies apparently, and had got through the first round or whatever they do, and was in a state of great excitement. and was preparing for the second sort of interrogation, and had mentioned it in the strictest privacy to a friend, and 2 days later got a call saying, "Don't bother, that's it."
Well, okay,
That's
in the
pretty
interest
good.
of
That's
full
pretty
disclosure,
good.
I'm
I was
going to
quite
ask you,
pleased
Jim.
about that.
Jim, were you
No.
ever tapped up?
No.
You have to say that.
Not as far as I know.
You have to say that.
Not as far as I know. I mean, I wouldn't have the
No,
thing
you'd
to
have known
say.
if you had.
I would be the worst spy. I mean, you know me.
I mean,
I would be, I would tell everybody everything.
that's what, yeah.
It's awful.
I just wanted to ask one question
Yes.
to you. How can you be such a stunning contributor here when you were on the radio from 1 till 5 this morning?
It's because it's very kind of you to put it like that. No, I got a couple of hours this morning. That's all right. But I came. This is a wonderful part of the country, and it just lifts me up. I'll be pretty rotten for the rest of the weekend, but it's fine. And the Euro elections, 10 o'clock Monday night, Radio 4, 5 Live. We'll be there.
Over there.
Sunday.
It was 52 years ago that Philby decamped to Moscow, and we've been talking about it, and you've been writing about it as though it happened yesterday.
Yeah.
Have there been any other similar incredible acts of betrayal in more recent years that you can write about?
Pollard in America.
Yes, Pollard in America, Ames in America. Aldrich Ames
Yeah.
is really the CIA's Philby. I mean, he did spectacular damage. Interestingly, at exactly the moment when the CIA was preening itself on having gone through the 70s and 80s without a spy in their midst, Aldrich Ames pops up, and it turns out that simply for money, he's been betraying everyone down the river. And his list of betrayals is extraordinary. No, I think it goes on all the time, but perhaps not with the same extraordinary kind of breadth and penetration that Philby managed. But that said, I mean, Ames was deep in the CIA. He was head of Soviet counterintelligence as well. I mean, he knew exactly where all the bodies were buried. So yes, I think it does go on. Philby has a particular resonance for us culturally, I think, and the fact that it is 50 years ago and yet yesterday is no accident, I think, because his defection was an enormous nail in the post-imperial confidence of Britain. I mean, I think he became an emblem, as so many other things did in 1963, of proof that we were no longer the country and the empire that we thought we had been.
And also, I think espionage has changed so much, hasn't it, with technology. So much more now gathered.
But there's something about it, just
a
a story which we've shared before, but I remember being shown a letter, I won't go into the long details of it, by somebody, we used to work for the Telegraph in Washington, who had been a Moscow correspondent and who went to I said to him, of course, for dinner, this is 30 years ago in Washington, I said, I would give my right eye to have written one story that you wrote. And he said, I know the one. This is a man called Richard Beeston, whose son, sadly now no longer with us, he was the foreign editor of the Times. He'd been in Moscow, went to the Bolshoi one evening, and he wrote a wonderful telegraph. So column 7 and 8, they made no fandango about it. Last night I went to the Bolshoi ballet. I felt a hand on my shoulder. A voice said, my God, it's Beeston. I turned round. It was Kim Philby. And they had been together in Beirut. Anyway, they had an exchange afterwards, and he showed me the letter, you've seen them, that he got from Philby, declining a meeting, although Philby was godfather to one of their children. And it was full of stuff about the Westminster School magazine, old so-and-so, saying, but my people won't let me. And yours ever, Kim. And you read, I'm afraid, I couldn't read this without the hairs at the back of my neck standing up. And I said, what was your conversation like? And he said, at one point, he said, well, he'd been in Moscow for 15 years. He said, how are things? What's it like? And Philby turned to him and said, what do you think? And his conclusion was, it was a nightmare.
One more question. Over there, sorry. Yeah.
The left flank.
Left flank, yeah.
Philby subverted every attempt at subversion behind the Iron Curtain, but I can't understand that every time they sent an agent, they never heard anything. It almost sounds like a gruesome Monty Python sketch. Oh, we send another, we send another. Why did they keep doing it?
It's a very good question. With hindsight, it's very easy to say, they should have stopped. But actually, so much of what was going on the other side was black to them anyway, that I think, actually, in truth, Operation Valuable was wound up pretty quickly. I mean, by 1953 they'd realised that something was going dramatically wrong with it. But I think it was a sort of hangover in a way from the war, the slightly sort of daring do idea that if it's going wrong, we'll just throw more at it. We'll just try again. There must be a way of breaking through. But no, it does. I mean, there are elements of it that are sort of, frankly, farcical,
Well, there's a total farcical. I mean, I remember being in Berlin just after the wall came down. It went back, well, actually, 10 years after. And we went, and a producer and I, a man, actually, who's written a biography of George Blake recently, a very good one, called Roger Hermiston, and I went, and we were in East Berlin, as it no longer was, and we said, well, why don't we try to get an interview with Marcus Wolf, who he was sort of Carla, really. I mean, he was the head of the East German intelligence service, I mean, the kind of Soviet outpost that ran people in this country. And he agreed to meet us in a coffee shop somewhere at the Alexanderplatz. And we went along, and we rang him up, and we said, well, how will we know you? And he said, it's all right, I'll know you, you know, the way they do. Anyway, so we went into this coffee shop, and here's the man, tall, domed head, the beard, the works, you see. And this is Marcus Wolf, the beast of the East German intelligence service. So we sit down, and we had an interview. Of course, he said nothing. I mean, it was pleasant and all the rest of it, but there was nothing you could use, really. And then at the end of it, he said, oh, I've got one thing. So I said, what's that? And he delved into his bag, and I thought, my God, what is it? And he had just written a cookbook, and he wanted to get it publicised on Radio 4. It is true. The head of the East German, I mean, marvellous. Cold War's over, this is my cookbook, and this is a terribly good Russian soup in here.
Brilliant.
And I thought, well, you know, you can't make this up.
Last killer question.
In the early 60s, I had aspirations to maybe become an actress, so I thought I'd better get some drama lessons. A few weeks into my lessons, my drama teacher said, would you be interested in taking part in a production in Wormwood Scrubs with the D Block? They're putting on a play. So I thought, and I said, OK, I'll do it. So I went, and the play went on, and I was working with the prisoners, as were 3 other ladies. And I got to know somebody called Sean Burke, who was in for quite a while. And then the production finished, and I went and worked in Germany. And in that time, Sean Burke had sprung George Blake. And when I came back from Germany, I bought a newspaper, and there was this big photograph of Sean Burke. Has anybody seen him? And I was very worried that I'd bump into him in London, what I'd do. My question is, where did George Blake and Vassal, who was also in Scrubs at the same time, where did they fit into the Philby spy ring?
Well, Vassal, I've always thought Vassal is a sort of sideline, really. I mean, he's really not a key figure. Blake is absolutely critical, and the treatment of Blake, and my friend here will know much more about this than I do, Jeremy will. Blake's treatment at the hand of the judiciary is in stark contrast to what happened to Philby. They decided to throw the book at him.
42 years.
42 years he got. I mean, it was an astonishing sentence. And I think the reason for that is that as clubbable as Philby was, Blake was not part of the club. He was Jewish, he was Dutch-born, he didn't speak with an English accent. And so I think it's a perfect example of the way that the group rallied around its own, but actually left people who were not thought to be at the top table out to dry. And I think the effect of the Blake conviction on Philby was very dramatic. I mean, he watched that happening and wondered whether it might happen to him, and it's part of his kind of disintegration at the end is because of what happened to Blake.
Very good. I can see another great talk on espionage coming up next year with the Blake trial and various other things where Jeremy Hutchinson was very much involved. I'd like to make 2 votes of thanks. First of all, to Ben and to Jim for their very lively contribution, and also to thank Rathfinny Estate for sponsoring this great discussion, and to say that even though we've enjoyed the martinis, we hope that we shall be able to enjoy Rathfinny wine, if not next year, then the year after. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you.